We live in a culture obsessed with comfort. Every advertisement promises an easier life. Every app claims to eliminate friction. Every guru sells a shortcut to happiness. We're told that pain is something to avoid, that struggle is a sign we're doing something wrong, that if we're suffering, we need to fix ourselves immediately. The modern world has built an entire economy around the eradication of discomfort. But what if this obsession with comfort is precisely what's making us weak? What if the very thing we're running from is exactly what we need? Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most provocative philosophers in history, argued something radical, that suffering isn't a problem to be solved, but a forge in which the strongest minds are created. He believed that those who avoid pain remain children, while those who embrace it become something beyond human. Nietzsche himself spent decades in physical agony, isolated and misunderstood, yet he produced some of the most powerful ideas in Western philosophy. He didn't succeed despite his suffering. He succeeded because of it. His pain became the crucible that refined his thinking, sharpened his perception, and forged his will into something unbreakable. This wasn't theory for him. It was lived reality. In this video, we're going to explore why Nietzsche saw suffering as essential to greatness, how pain functions as a psychological and spiritual transformer, and what it actually means to use adversity as fuel rather than letting it destroy you. You'll discover why comfort might be your greatest enemy, how the strongest minds are forged in fire, and what it takes to transform suffering into power. Imagine a blade fresh from the mine, dull, brittle, shapeless. It has potential, but it's useless. Now imagine that same blade thrust into fire, hammered repeatedly, folded and reforged dozens of times. Each strike seems violent, each moment in the flames unbearable. But this is exactly what transforms raw metal into a weapon that can cut through anything. Nietzsche saw human beings the same way. He observed something most people refuse to acknowledge. Comfort produces mediocrity. When life is easy, when every desire is satisfied, when there's no resistance, people don't develop strength. They develop entitlement. They become soft, reactive, dependent on external circumstances for their sense of stability. They live at the mercy of their environment because they've never been forced to build an internal foundation. Look at someone who's never faced real adversity. They collapse at the first sign of difficulty. A relationship ends, and they're devastated for years. They lose a job, and their entire identity crumbles. A friend criticizes them, and they spiral into self-doubt. Their psychological structure is fragile because it's never been tested. They're like a tree that's grown in a greenhouse, tall perhaps, but with shallow roots that can't withstand any storm. Now look at someone who's been through hell and emerged intact. They have a different quality. There's a groundedness, a quiet intensity, a refusal to be shaken by circumstances that would destroy others. They've learned that they can endure more than they thought possible. Pain has taught them what comfort never could, that they are stronger than their suffering. Nietzsche understood this from direct experience. He suffered from chronic migraines so severe he could barely function. He experienced near blindness, digestive problems, insomnia, and isolation that lasted years. His books were ignored or ridiculed. He watched lesser minds receive acclaim while his work was dismissed. He had every reason to collapse into bitterness and despair, but instead, he used that pain as raw material. He studied his own suffering with the precision of a scientist examining a specimen. He asked, "What does this reveal about human nature? What does this teach me about strength? What can I forge from this?" His philosophy didn't emerge from abstract theorizing. It emerged from his lived confrontation with agony and his refusal to let it break him. The people who came to him, through his writings, through his ideas, were those who recognized this quality. They weren't looking for comfort or reassurance. They were looking for truth, even if it was harsh. They understood that real transformation requires fire. They sensed that Nietzsche wasn't offering an easy path, but a powerful one. But most people don't want power. They want relief. They want someone to tell them they're fine as they are, that they don't need to change, that their problems are someone else's fault. They want pills, distractions, quick fixes. They treat suffering as an enemy rather than recognizing it as the only force capable of producing genuine strength. Nietzsche saw this clearly. He watched people numb themselves, distract themselves, blame others, create elaborate stories to avoid facing their pain. And he recognized that in doing so, they were forfeiting the only opportunity they had to become something extraordinary. They were choosing comfort over greatness. This is the paradox at the heart of human psychology. The things that hurt us most are often the things that transform us most. The breakdown that feels like an ending is actually a beginning. The loss that seems unbearable is the catalyst for a complete restructuring of identity. The suffering we try desperately to avoid is the precise mechanism through which strength is built. If this content is resonating with you, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Because what Nietzsche understood, and what most of modern psychology has forgotten, is that there is no transformation without crisis, no strength without resistance, no greatness without suffering. The question isn't whether you'll face pain, you will. The question is whether you'll use it to forge something unbreakable or let it destroy you. And that choice, Nietzsche believed, is what separates those who remain weak from those who become powerful beyond measure. Most people misunderstand what Nietzsche meant by strength. They think he was advocating for aggression, domination, or cruelty. They reduce his philosophy to a caricature of macho posturing. But Nietzsche's concept of strength was far more sophisticated and far more demanding than that. He called it the will to power. Not power over others, but power over oneself. The capacity to direct one's own life, to create one's own values, to withstand suffering without collapsing into resentment or self-pity. It was the ability to say yes to life even in its most painful moments, to affirm existence even when it seemed unbearable. Nietzsche developed these ideas during a period of radical isolation. In 1879, at the age of 34, his health deteriorated so severely that he was forced to resign from his professorship at the University of Basel. For the next decade, he lived alone, moving between small towns and cheap boarding houses, trying to find climates that might ease his physical torment. During this time, he had almost no contact with other intellectuals. His books sold poorly, his ideas were misunderstood or ignored. He lived on a small pension, barely enough to survive. He spent days in darkened rooms, unable to read or write because of his eyesight and migraines. By any conventional measure, this period should have destroyed him, but this was precisely when his most important work emerged. Isolated from academic approval, freed from the need to conform to others' expectations, he began to think with complete independence. He examined his own suffering not with self-pity, but with curiosity. What was this experience teaching him? What could be learned from pain that couldn't be learned any other way? The process was brutal. There were no moments of sudden enlightenment, no mystical revelations, no comfort. Just years of grinding confrontation with his own limitations, his own weaknesses, his own mortality. Day after day, sitting with pain, observing how his mind tried to escape it, watching the patterns of resentment and self-deception arise. He saw how suffering reveals everything hidden. When life is comfortable, you can maintain illusions about yourself, that you're strong, that you're virtuous, that you're in control. But when real pain comes, all those illusions collapse. You see exactly how weak you are, how quickly you blame others, how desperately you reach for anything that might provide relief. This confrontation with his own psychological machinery, the defenses, the rationalizations, the escape mechanisms became the foundation of his philosophy. He realized that most people never see themselves clearly because they never experience enough pressure to crack their self-image. They live in a fog of comfortable self-deception. Nietzsche began to understand suffering not as something that happens to you, but as something that reveals who you are. It strips away everything superficial and shows you your actual substance. And for most people, what it reveals is terrifying. They're far weaker, far more dependent, far more cowardly than they believed. But here's where Nietzsche's insight becomes transformative. He argued that this revelation, however painful, is precisely what you need. Because once you see clearly how weak you are, you can begin the work of becoming strong. Once you recognize your dependence on external validation, you can build internal authority. Once you face your cowardice, you can forge courage. The key is what you do with the suffering. Most people let it make them bitter. They become resentful, blaming the world for their pain, or they become victims, building an identity around their suffering, using it to manipulate others' sympathy, or they become numb, medicating themselves into a kind of living death. But there's another option. You can use suffering as raw material. You can study it, learn from it, let it burn away everything false in you. You can let it forge you into something harder, clearer, more powerful. This requires a specific orientation, not avoiding pain, not wallowing in it, but transforming it. This transformation isn't about positive thinking or finding the silver lining. It's about something far more demanding. It's about looking directly at your suffering, understanding its function, and using it to reconstruct yourself from the ground up. It's about becoming someone who doesn't need life to be easy, because they've built an internal structure that can withstand anything. Nietzsche believed that only those willing to undergo this process, to let suffering transform rather than destroy them, could achieve what he called greatness. Not greatness in the sense of fame or recognition, but greatness in the sense of becoming fully yourself, of creating your own values, of living with complete authenticity regardless of external circumstances. And this brings us to the practical question: how? How do you actually use suffering to forge strength rather than letting it break you? What does this process look like in concrete terms? Because philosophy without practice is just intellectual entertainment. The answer lies in a specific set of disciplines that Nietzsche practiced himself and prescribed for anyone seeking transformation. Not comfort-seeking strategies, not numbing mechanisms, but practices that intensify your confrontation with reality until something fundamental shifts in how you perceive yourself and your suffering. Let's examine exactly what these practices are and how they function to transform pain into power. What Nietzsche prescribed wasn't meditation or therapy or any conventional self-help practice. He called it self-overcoming, a systematic process of confronting and transcending your current limitations. This isn't something you do once, it's a way of living, a constant pressure you place on yourself to become more than you currently are. But self-overcoming needs structure. Without specific practices, it remains an abstract ideal that accomplishes nothing. Nietzsche understood this. His philosophy emerged from concrete disciplines he practiced daily, often in excruciating circumstances. These weren't comfortable practices, they were forges. Here's how this transformation actually works, broken into 4 essential pillars that Nietzsche himself employed. Solitude without escape. Nietzsche spent years in radical isolation, not by choice initially, but by circumstance. But he transformed this isolation into a practice. This means periods of complete solitude. No entertainment, no distraction, no numbing. Just you and your thoughts and your suffering. Most people can't handle 15 minutes of this without reaching for their phone. Nietzsche spent months in darkened rooms with nothing but his own mind. This solitude forces you to confront everything you normally avoid. All your weaknesses, your fears, your self-deceptions become impossible to ignore. This is where self-knowledge begins. Embrace discomfort systematically. Nietzsche deliberately chose difficult paths. He walked for hours despite physical pain. He wrote despite migraines that made thinking nearly impossible. He lived in harsh climates on minimal resources. This wasn't masochism. It was training. When you systematically choose discomfort, you build psychological resilience. You teach your nervous system that discomfort isn't an emergency. You prove to yourself repeatedly that you can function despite pain. Most people organize their entire lives around avoiding discomfort, and this makes them fragile. Deliberately seeking difficulty makes you unbreakable. Question everything you believe. Nietzsche's method was ruthless self-examination. He questioned every belief, every value, every assumption he held. Why do I believe this? Whose interest does this belief serve? What am I avoiding by holding on to this? This practice destroys comfortable illusions. It reveals that much of what you think is your own opinion is actually inherited programming. Ideas you absorbed from your culture, your family, your peers, without ever examining them. Real strength requires building your values from the ground up, not accepting prepackaged belief systems. Document your transformation. Nietzsche kept detailed records of his thoughts, his struggles, his insights. Not for publication initially, but for clarity. Writing forces precision. It makes your thinking concrete. When you write about your suffering, you transform it from something that's happening to you into something you're observing and analyzing. This shift in perspective from victim to observer is crucial. You're no longer drowning in pain. You're studying it, understanding its patterns, using it as data for your transformation. These 4 pillars worked for Nietzsche because they forced constant confrontation with reality. No escape, no comfort, no self-deception. Just persistent pressure that gradually transforms your psychological structure. He didn't develop his philosophy through abstract theorizing. He developed it through years of these practices applied relentlessly, even when, especially when, he wanted to quit. The result was a mind of extraordinary clarity and strength, someone who could face the darkest aspects of human existence without flinching, who could acknowledge suffering without becoming bitter, who could create meaning in a meaningless universe through sheer force of will. This is what these practices produce. But here's what's crucial. This process requires genuine commitment, not the casual, "I'll try this for a week" approach that characterizes most self-improvement attempts. Real commitment means accepting that you're going to be uncomfortable, that progress will be slow, that you'll want to quit dozens of times, and that you'll do it anyway. Most people aren't willing to pay this price. They want transformation without discomfort, strength without struggle. They want Nietzsche's insights without Nietzsche's discipline. And so they remain weak, constantly seeking new strategies, new techniques, new shortcuts that promise results without effort. But if you're willing to engage with these practices seriously, if you're willing to accept genuine discomfort in service of real transformation, something begins to shift. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, inevitably, the person you were begins to dissolve, and someone stronger begins to emerge. And this is where the real difficulty begins. Because as you start to change, as your old patterns begin to break down, something terrifying happens. The comfortable self you've built your life around starts to die. And before the new self fully forms, there's a period of profound disorientation where you're neither who you were nor who you're becoming. This is the confrontation that breaks most people, and it's exactly what we need to examine next. There comes a moment in any genuine transformation when everything falls silent. The motivation that propelled you forward vanishes. The excitement of new practices fades. You're left alone with the raw reality of what you're attempting, and it's suddenly crushingly clear how difficult this actually is. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy stops being theory and becomes brutal, lived experience. Because the practices themselves aren't the real test. The real test is what emerges when you stick with them long enough that your psychological defenses start to crack. You sit in solitude, no distractions, no escape, and suddenly you're confronted with everything you've been running from your entire life. The fear that you're fundamentally inadequate, the rage at people who hurt you, the grief over opportunities you missed, the shame about who you've been. All of it surfaces at once, and it's overwhelming. Your mind launches counterattacks. It tells you this is pointless, that you were fine before, that you're making things worse. It generates elaborate rationalizations for why you should quit. It creates emergencies, sudden urgent tasks that require your immediate attention. It manufactures physical symptoms. It does everything possible to get you to stop this process and return to comfortable patterns. And if you push through those defenses, something even more disturbing happens. The identity you've built your entire life around begins to dissolve. The story you tell yourself about who you are, the good person, the victim, the hero, the intellectual, whatever narrative you've constructed, starts to reveal itself as fiction. Nietzsche described this as the death of God within yourself. The collapse of the absolute authority you've been unconsciously obeying. Maybe it's your parents' expectations, maybe it's society's values, maybe it's the image you've been desperately trying to maintain. Whatever it is, it loses its power over you, and this loss feels like falling into an abyss. Because here's what nobody tells you about transformation. Before you become strong, you become nothing. There's a gap, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, where the old you has died but the new you hasn't yet formed. You're in psychological freefall, with no ground beneath you and no certainty about where you'll land. This is the loneliest place imaginable. You can't explain what you're going through to others because it doesn't make sense even to you. People around you notice you've changed and don't like it. They pressure you to go back to who you were because that person was predictable, manageable, safe, but you can't go back. That person is dead. Nietzsche knew this territory intimately. He spent years in this psychological void, questioning everything, certain of nothing, isolated from everyone. He called it nihilism, not as a philosophy, but as a lived state, the moment when all meaning collapses and you're left staring into emptiness. Most people can't handle this. They panic and rush back to old patterns, back to comfortable beliefs, back to the familiar identity, even if it's false. They declare the whole process a mistake. They decide suffering isn't transformative after all, it's just suffering, and they'd rather be comfortable and weak than strong and terrified. But Nietzsche argued that this void, this nihilistic gap, is precisely where transformation happens. It's the empty space where something genuinely new can emerge. If you rush to fill it with familiar patterns, you've learned nothing. But if you can sit in that emptiness, if you can tolerate the terror of not knowing who you are or what anything means, something extraordinary begins to occur. You start to see that you're not your thoughts, not your emotions, not your identity. All of those are constructions, patterns you learned, stories you've been telling. But beneath them is something more fundamental, a capacity for awareness, for choice, for creation. Not the comfortable you that was shaped by circumstances, but something harder, clearer, more essential. This is what Nietzsche meant by the overman. Not a perfect being, but someone who's died and been reborn through their own will. Someone who's faced the abyss and emerged with the capacity to create their own meaning, their own values, their own purpose. Not borrowed from others, not inherited from culture, but forged in the fire of genuine suffering. But getting there requires enduring this death phase without flinching. It requires accepting that transformation is violent, that it will strip away everything comfortable, that there will be long periods where you have no idea if this will work. It requires trusting the process, even when the process feels like destruction. And then, gradually, something begins to shift. The chaos starts to organize itself. The emptiness begins to fill, not with old patterns, but with something new, something that's actually yours. You start to sense that you're not being destroyed, but rebuilt, that the pain has been burning away what was false so that something true can emerge. This is the turning point, the moment when suffering stops being something that's happening to you and becomes something you're consciously using, when pain becomes fuel rather than obstacle. When you realize you're not surviving this process, you're being forged by it, and what emerges on the other side is unrecognizable to who you were before. The transformation doesn't announce itself. There's no dramatic moment where you suddenly feel powerful or enlightened. Instead, you notice small things. You're in a situation that would have triggered intense anxiety before, and you feel nothing. Someone criticizes you, and instead of defensiveness, there's just curiosity. A loss occurs that would have devastated you previously, and you absorb it, adjust, continue. The change is so subtle that you almost miss it. You realize you've been functioning differently for weeks without noticing. The person who was terrified of solitude now seeks it. The person who needed constant validation no longer thinks about it. The person who collapsed under pressure now handles it like it's nothing. Here's the irony. When you re-emerge from this process, nobody celebrates. Because what you've gained, psychological strength, internal authority, clarity about what matters, isn't visible or impressive to others. You haven't acquired wealth or status or conventional success. You've just become fundamentally different in ways that aren't immediately obvious. People sense something has changed, and it makes them uncomfortable. You're no longer as reactive, as needy, as controllable. You don't respond to the same manipulations. You don't share the same fears. You're operating from a different set of values that they don't understand and didn't approve. Some people will resent this. They'll accuse you of being cold, detached, arrogant. They'll say you've lost your humanity when really you've just stopped performing the weakness they expected from you. They'll interpret your strength as a judgment of their lack of it, which it is, though not in the way they think. Others simply won't understand. They'll ask what happened to you, and you won't be able to explain because the transformation occurred in a realm they've never accessed. You can't describe the death and rebirth you experience to someone who's never questioned their own identity. The words don't exist. but for those who recognize what you've done, the ones who've walked similar paths, who've faced their own abyss, who know what it costs to forge genuine strength, there's immediate recognition, not of superiority, but of kinship. These are people who've stopped performing, stopped pretending, stopped living according to others' scripts. Nietzsche called these people free spirits, not in the sense of carefree or rebellious, but free from the need for external validation, free from inherited values, free to create their own meaning. They've undergone the crucible and emerged capable of standing alone, of affirming their own existence regardless of others' opinions. This is what the process produces. Not someone who's escaped suffering, but someone who's integrated it, who's learned to use pain as a tool rather than being used by it, who's developed such internal stability that external circumstances no longer dictate their psychological state. You become someone others can't quite categorize. You don't fit into familiar boxes. You're not the victim seeking sympathy, not the hero seeking admiration, not the rebel seeking attention. You're simply present, clear, grounded in a way that seems almost alien in a culture built on performance and anxiety. And here's what Nietzsche understood that most people miss. This transformation isn't about reaching a final destination. There's no point where you're done becoming strong. The process is ongoing. Each new challenge, each new suffering, each new crisis is another opportunity to forge something harder, clearer, more essential. The difference is that now you know how to use it. You've learned the alchemy of turning pain into power. When suffering comes, and it will come because life is suffering, you don't collapse. You don't numb yourself. You don't pretend it isn't happening. You engage with it consciously, studying what it's revealing, using it to refine yourself further. This is what Nietzsche meant when he talked about amor fati, love of fate. Not passive acceptance, but active affirmation. Saying yes to everything that happens, including and especially the painful things, because you've learned that pain is the only force capable of producing real growth. People who've reached this point move through the world differently. There's an ease to them, not because life has become easy, but because they've stopped fighting against its fundamental nature. They've accepted that struggle is inevitable, that comfort is temporary, that suffering is the price of consciousness. But they've also discovered something most people never learn, that you can bear far more than you think possible, that psychological strength, unlike physical strength, has no upper limit, that every time you think you've reached your breaking point and then don't break, you expand your capacity to endure. This doesn't make you invulnerable. You still feel pain, still experience loss, still face moments of doubt and fear. But you're no longer controlled by these experiences. They're weather patterns that move through you without determining your fundamental state. And this, finally, is freedom. Not the absence of constraint, but the presence of internal authority. The ability to choose your response regardless of circumstances. The capacity to create meaning even in meaningless situations. The strength to stand alone when necessary, to build your own values when existing ones fail. To affirm your existence even when the universe seems indifferent. This is what suffering forges in those rare individuals willing to face it without flinching. Not happiness, not comfort, not peace, but something far more valuable. A strength that can't be taken away because it's built from the inside out, tempered by fire, refined by pain, unbreakable because it's been broken and rebuilt so many times that it's learned how to reform itself no matter what happens. And once you've achieved this, once you've undergone this transformation and emerged with this capacity, you face a final question. Not about what you've gained, but about what you'll do with it. Real courage isn't facing external threats. It's facing yourself, the parts you've hidden, the truths you've avoided, the potential you've suppressed. It's choosing to undergo voluntary transformation rather than waiting for circumstances to force it upon you. This is what Nietzsche meant by self-overcoming. The process he described, isolation, discomfort, self-examination, documentation, isn't a sequence of techniques. It's a form of alchemy. You're taking the raw material of your current self, with all its weaknesses and delusions and comfortable patterns, and subjecting it to intense heat and pressure until something fundamentally different emerges. Nietzsche understood that most people never attempt this because they correctly sense how violent it is. They intuit that real transformation requires a kind of death, and they're not willing to die even metaphorically. They'd rather remain weak and comfortable than become strong through suffering. But for those who choose this path, and it is a choice however much circumstances might push you toward it, there's a particular quality that emerges. Not arrogance but quiet certainty. Not aggression but unshakable presence. Not superiority but absolute ownership of your existence. True freedom isn't doing whatever you want, it's becoming someone who can withstand anything. It's developing such internal stability that external circumstances lose their power to destabilize you. It's building a self that's not dependent on validation, not shaped by fear, not controlled by comfort seeking. This person, the one who's undergone complete transformation, has several distinctive qualities. They're radically honest because they've stopped protecting a false self-image. They're comfortable with uncertainty because they've lived through the dissolution of certainty and survived. They're unattached to outcomes because they've learned that you can't control results, only your response to them. They don't need to prove anything because they've already proven everything that matters to themselves. They don't seek approval because they've developed internal authority that's more reliable than external validation. They don't fear judgment because they've already judged themselves more harshly than anyone else could. But perhaps most importantly, they're no longer at war with reality. They've stopped demanding that life be different than it is. They've accepted suffering as fundamental rather than aberrational. They've integrated pain into their existence rather than treating it as an interruption of normal life. This doesn't mean they're resigned or passive, quite the opposite. Because they've stopped wasting energy fighting against inevitable suffering, they have tremendous energy available for creative action. They're not paralyzed by fear of pain because they know they can handle it. They're not cautious about taking risks because they've learned that they can rebuild themselves no matter what happens. This is what Nietzsche meant when he said that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Not that suffering automatically produces strength. Most people are weakened by suffering because they let it make them bitter or fearful. But if you engage with suffering consciously, if you use it as material for transformation rather than letting it destroy you, it forges something unbreakable. And this strength, this capacity to face reality without flinching, to create meaning in meaningless circumstances, to stand alone when necessary, is what Nietzsche believed humanity needs most. Not more comfort, not more security, not more protection from suffering, but more individuals willing to undergo the fire that transforms weakness into power. Because the world doesn't need more people seeking ease. It needs people capable of bearing weight, of facing difficulty, of maintaining clarity and purpose when everything is falling apart. It needs minds forged in suffering rather than sheltered from it. This isn't a philosophy of cruelty or callousness. It's a recognition that strength is built, not given. That character is forged, not inherited. That the most valuable human qualities, courage, resilience, wisdom, authenticity, emerge only through confrontation with difficulty. And if you're willing to face that difficulty, if you're willing to let suffering forge you rather than break you, you'll discover something remarkable, that you're capable of far more than you ever imagined. That pain isn't your enemy, but your teacher. That the person you could become is waiting on the other side of everything you're currently afraid to face. This transformation isn't for everyone. It requires sacrifice of comfort, of certainty, of the familiar self you've built your life around. But for those who choose it, who commit to it fully, who refuse to turn back no matter how painful the process becomes, it offers something that no amount of comfort or security ever could: genuine freedom. So ask yourself, are you willing to let suffering forge you into something stronger? Or will you spend your life running from pain, organizing everything around comfort, becoming weaker with each avoidance? What would it mean to face the thing you're most afraid of, not as catastrophe, but as opportunity? To see your greatest pain not as your enemy, but as the exact force required to transform you into someone capable of things you currently can't imagine? Nietzsche believed that suffering is the fundamental human experience and that our only meaningful choice is how we respond to it. We can let it make us bitter, resentful, and weak. Or we can use it as raw material for self-creation, forging ourselves into something harder, clearer, stronger with each encounter. If this video challenged your perspective on suffering or made you reconsider what strength actually means, leave your like and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the human mind through Nietzsche's most provocative ideas. Until the next video,